One. Hello and welcome to the talk, Collective Remembering Mike MacDonald's Medicine and Butterfly Gardens. This is the Hooker Distinguished Visiting Scholar Lecture by Lisa Myers. My name is Stephanie Springay and I am the director of the School of the Arts at McMaster University. And I am joining the Zoom from Takaranto, the land of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, and the Mississaugas of the Credit River. And McMaster is in the lands represented by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Lisa Myers is the 2021 Hooker Distinguished Visiting Professor at McMaster University. And funding support for Myers' walks and lecture include the President's Office, the School of the Arts, McMaster Museum of Art, English and Cultural Studies, Gender and Social Justice, Communication Studies and Multimedia, Global Peace and Social Justice, and History. Lisa Myers is Anishinaabe from Beausoleil First Nation on her mother's side and European descent on her father's. She is an independent curator, artist, and an associate professor in the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change at York University and a York Research Chair of Indigenous Art and Curatorial Practice. She is currently co-leading an interdisciplinary research project with ecologist Dr. Sheila Kola, considering wild pollinators, ecology, and art, where she focuses on the gardens by the late Mi'kmaq artist Mike MacDonald. Myers is working towards a retrospective of MacDonald's artwork to open at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery in the summer of 2022. She has an MFA in criticism and curatorial practice from OCAD University and is Port Severin and Toronto based. This talk coincides with an audio walk on Mike MacDonald's garden in Gage Park in Hamilton, and you can pick up a QR code postcard in the McMaster Museum of Art to do the guided walk. So I want everyone to have a warm welcome for Lisa, and just a little bit about tonight's format. Once the lecture is complete, I will moderate the Q&A. Those of you in the Zoom, please feel free to turn your cameras on and use the raise hand button, or you can type your questions into the chat and I will monitor the chat and read them out to Lisa. For those of you joining us on YouTube, unfortunately, there's no Q&A function at this time, but we welcome you also to this lecture and to this space. So welcome, Lisa, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I am really happy to be here. I'm just going to share my screen. Here we go. And let's get this set up. All right. Can you see that all right? Confirmation, thumbs up. Anybody? Thank you.
All good. Yes, perfect.
Awesome. All right. Can you see it when it's like that? Okay. Just making sure the parameters are fine. All right. Bonjour. Indinawe magana dok. Bungi etigo inta Anishinaabe moen. I only know a little bit of Ojibwe. Gaga Gige Anishinaabe Kwe Ndao. I'm Anishinaabe. Wapshashi Dodem. I'm a Martin clan. Nisaway Gamikwe Indugo. This they call me Nisaway Gamikwe, which is an Anishinaabe name, means center of the water. Gichinsing Indonjaba. This is my community. I'm acknowledging my community, the community of Chimnasing or Beausoleil First Nation. Port Severin Dinda. This is where I reside in Port Severin. Mio Minik Wa Ikudoyan Nongam. I'm happy to be with you today. And Miigwech Bizindawayag, thank you for being here to listen to me. I want to start by just saying that I'm really honored to be invited here as a distinguished professor I'm humbled by this invitation, and upon reflecting on this moment, I want to explain that this is not a given, that being here defies most everyone's expectations, including my own. And I would also like to start by saying Chi-miigwech and thank you to McMaster University and Stephanie Springay for inviting me, and the faculty there at the School of the Arts. So I have some friends there, Carmela and also Sally Mackay. So it's really nice to see you today. I also want to say miigwech and nawe to Carrie McMullen from the Indigenous Studies program, who did her best to show us around and to show us the possibilities for being on site if we could, but we can't as much. And I would like to thank Pamela Edmonds and the staff at McMaster Museum of Art for working with me to produce a project at Gage Park, and also the curator William Kingfisher for inviting me to be in that in his show there. I wanted to just in learning about Gage Park and Mike MacDonald's project there many years ago, I was assisted, or I was happy to be happy that Ivan Jurakic could take me for a walk through the garden and show me images of some of the documentation of the walk that Mike had done through that garden. And so I want to thank him and thank him for his efforts, and also the photographer who took those photos of Mike so many years ago, whose name escapes me right now, but I want to acknowledge it, put it out there. So I'm going to I want to just make sure that I have made said thank you to all of the appropriate people that have made it possible. And I also want to thank the other person I want to thank is my colleague Sheila Kola, who I've been working with on this project Finding Flowers, where I've been able to research Mike MacDonald's gardens across the country, his gardens, medicine and butterfly garden artworks. I want to thank Sheila for reaching out to me to work together. That I thank her for her seeing the potential in what we could do together, and I'm really enjoying the process of working with Sheila, who's more from the sciences, and so it's a transdisciplinary project that we have in Finding Flowers, and say miigwech to Sheila for her work and also her vision of seeing potential in our working together. All right, so this is a paper I'm working on. It's a draft form, so there's ideas. There's lots of ideas flying around. I'm excited to present it to you, and I'm also really interested in your questions and comments. So feel free to share those at the end. So I'll start here. So I'll mainly be reading from this, and I find writing is a really great way to understand what I've learned, and so I usually approach it in that way. And I'm just so here we go. If we think of land and waterways as readable, a kind of document within the edges of a page, limiting its breadth rather than a range that is fluid and ever-changing, living and legible, then we can see how one's understanding of land grows over long periods of time. And I'm using the metaphor of a paper document in this instance to play with the material fibers that convey the way that land is mapped, governed, and upheld through colonial logics of resource and property outlined legally through a paper trail of contracts and permits. And we got to keep in mind that permits and legislation are part of a colonial means of dispossession. And we can see this historically, but also ongoing. And it inscribes and given legal effect through paperwork. So here I am playing with this idea of document and land. Permits enable mining and logging and other extractive industries across large areas of land, changing physical space quickly and interrupting cultural legibility of land. So this legibility that I'm talking about in this reading of land is from an Indigenous perspective. Such changes also happen legislatively. For example, the Omnibus Bill 197 here in Ontario is fast-tracking permits for development administered through and held within the surfaces and the edges of paper documents. The late Mi'kmaq artist Mike MacDonald, who was also Beothuk and of European ancestry, was a documentarian and a media artist who later in his practice created medicine and butterfly garden artworks. He passed on in 2006 in Halifax, Nova Scotia. And myself, and as curator and artist, Adrian Stimpson states, McDonald, and I quote, "McDonald was a warrior for the environment," end quote. Since first writing about McDonald's work in 2014, I have been extremely drawn to it, his early video work, his installations, and also his garden artworks. I too studied video when I was younger, and I was also ran a community garden at an Indigenous organization north of Toronto for 9 years, where I learned about medicine plants and also planted a medicine garden and spent time in elders' medicine gardens. Other artists have responded to McDonald's work, and from the work of Anne Riley and Cease Weiss, I learned that Mike MacDonald was also two-spirit or gay. His work does not express this overtly, and I've not seen it in his writing specifically, but many artists and curators have referenced the symbolism of butterflies and transformation as metaphors for two-spirit identity. I've not found any, like I said, of his writing that clearly states that he identified as two-spirit or gay or queer or whatever name label one would use. But as I mentioned this, I want to keep the terms open, but acknowledge how important I find this aspect of his identity as an Indigenous queer person myself. And that I found out this much later after I started working on researching his work for a couple of years. So through documentaries, McDonald features contestations where extractive industries such as clear-cut logging or mining undermined Indigenous people's land, revealing conflict between Indigenous people, the state of Canada, and industry around access and sovereignty to land for resource extraction. Around access, but imposing on the sovereignty to land for the purposes of resource extraction. Elsewhere, I argue that this video work is evidence and has an evidentiary value of Indigenous people's connection to their traditional lands. However, here I want to think through McDonald's medicine and butterfly garden artworks as more than a response to resource extraction, but as a site to assert energy towards continuance of plant knowledge and language. Through my research on his gardens, I seek to understand how these gardens re-inscribe plant and language knowledge. McDonald's garden artworks emerge from a similar place and time as his video work. So that's like the late 80s, 90s, and then into the early 2000s. Considering recent texts on Indigenous studies on plants and place, much plant knowledge is relevant in the context of Aboriginal rights to land and recognized in law through treaty rights and land claims. For example, in the case of the Silk versus British Columbia, ethno-ecological and ethno-botanical evidence from elders and other expert witnesses played a pivotal role in helping the Silcotin Nation establish at trial that they exclusively occupied their lands, acknowledging the problematics of the colonial recognition of occupancy, of course, but that I found it really interesting that their knowledge of plants was part of proving their occupancy, and occupancy is what the Canadian legal system looks for in terms of Aboriginal land title. Plants and trees are part of Anishinaabe terms of good life, so Minnow B'Madzwin. And Potawatomi scholar Kyle White, his concept of collective continuance, I find is useful in thinking about how language, plant knowledge are connected, and also language and land are connected. White explains that cultural continuities such as language, Minoan cultivation, and all different kinds of cultural knowledge and customary practice are part of self-determination and resistance to domination. And he calls these ecologies of continuance. And I appreciate this concept in its decolonial potential, but also its sort of anti or non-colonial assertions. And what I mean by that is that it asserts knowledge that comes from, it's not always in tension or in tension with colonial forces. It's sort of, it is, of course, there's no escape, but there is a kind of assertion of cultural knowledge, which comes through different practices. And I see that as a kind of anti-colonial assertion. So I take it up as I take this up as a lens to look through which to consider McDonald's garden projects in the realm of land, in relation to conversations about land back as well. And in terms of considering how a garden that encourages learning about plant medicines and the interconnection of living beings carries collective continuance as well. And from an Anishinaabe creation story, I know that plants came before almost all beings, and so they are teachers in that sense, and they do lead. They lead to learning about sustenance, about food, about healing, about insects, about water, about soil, and particularly interested in, I'm particularly interested in centering language around what I learned from plants. And in many ways, McDonald also thought of the plants and the butterflies as teachers. So. Okay. Okay. So considering McDonald's gardens within the paradigm of returning land and land back, I feel that planting native plants on a municipal lands in urban space re-inscribes plants that were once maybe abundant in that place. But it is also a way of inserting a mnemonic, a reminder, a remembering to call on Indigenous language and plant/land knowledge, which is one part of the intangible value of land, our languages. And in this way, these gardens as living archives of relations, including the relations between plants, pollinators, soil, sunlight, water, and many other elements. And as an artwork, these gardens have symbolism and representational meaning, ecological function, cultural and relational purpose and existence. The term garden carries connotations of imperialist expansion of empire through concepts of landscape and landscaping. Within landscaping lies an attendant reference to agriculture and Lockean theories of land as productive only through agriculture. McDonald's gardens, however, are not ornamental French or English gardens, nor are they agricultural crops. Growing and cultivation take different forms for First Nations people, and our aid in the cultivation of plants may happen through propagation and planting, but also through the way we harvest and forage perennial foods if we have access to that. And to be sure that we will grow, to be sure that they will grow back and continue to proliferate. In this way, I see McDonald's use of the term garden as not just meaning plants and flowers, but the ecologies and interdependence within these growing spaces. I also see these gardens as sites that may compel the institution that they're hosted at, so the gallery or museum, the institution to consider the land and the land outside of their walls, and the bureaucracy involved in putting in a planting space, which every institution still has to often jump through different kinds of hoops to do so, which makes the curatorial concern of a gallery proper outside the vault and outside the building. So and I propose that that's what some of Mike's gardens were doing. As shared with me by Anishinaabe artist and curator William Kingfisher, the word for garden in Anishinaabe-Moan is gitigan, meaning spots on the land, which suggests, and I'm not a language speaker, so I'm speaking, explaining this from the perspective of a language learner, so I'm humbly still learning. So this word gitigan means spots on the land, which suggests leaving a mark and a trace of being. McDonald's gardens are such spaces, I would say, leaving marks and traces of plant knowledge and its interconnectedness. I also associate McDonald's gardens as spaces of resistance. Their form and materials are resisting, for one, very literally the monoculture, resisting monocultures, and whether that be many blades of grass. And I see it as a somewhat of an institutional critique, intervening in the institution, intervening in the the conventions of care that happen in galleries that are also often very focused and mostly focused in the vault and their art collection. So it's a way to call them, to look at land, call the museum or gallery to look at land and to tend to it. They also, this idea of resisting the grass or the lawn that are often surrounding many of these institutions, I think is really interesting too. The ubiquitous grass or lawn plant is taken, it's been a practice of proud homeowners. And there's scholar Paul Robbins explains in his book, Lawn People, the control, this is a kind of control over the environment, and that the lawn represents all that comes into play when maintaining turf. And also acknowledges the ecological and economic consequences of lawns in general. So I find this kind of resistance to the monoculture a kind of interesting concept that I'm going to play with in the final draft of this paper. They further take up land and are resilient. The gardens take up land and are resilient in their rootedness and the perennial ways, the roots, the leaves, the flowers and fruit as they host pollinators and other living beings. Anishinaabe curator Wanda Nanabush explains that the word resistance translated into one Anishinaabe dialect infers rootedness, and she elucidates that resistance, I quote, becomes a metaphor for planting or planted, end quote. And in a sense, being rooted is part of this concept of resistance that I'm trying to write about in Mike MacDonald's work. As artworks planted outside of museums or galleries, MacDonald's work further resists the position of the fine art object. MacDonald's gardens reintroduce Indigenous plants into municipal places. They are these medicine and butterfly gardens are kind of messy. They call for a kind of different kind of care than the art object. So they introduce these gardens in particular, reintroduce Indigenous plants into municipal spaces. These gardens invite me as a language learner to consider what words, sentences, and phrases does this garden remind me of, or can teach me, or make me learn. This is part of the resistance that I'm interested in, what resistance to the municipal grounds keeping does. How does this garden push that? And how does a garden as an artwork become a huge care project for the public gallery in general? I approach these gardens as an Anishinaabe artist curator who is also a language learner and also considering my mixed European background as well. And I am interested in understanding how land, language, and plant knowledge connect. And I'm also considering that MacDonald's artwork involved planting on sites across this land now known as Canada. Therefore, these gardens exist or existed on many different traditional lands of First Nations communities, surrounded by diverse plant life and different languages. So each garden that is across the country, which I'm going to show you, or at least show you the map of where they were. Each garden was composed in distinct ways, but all of his gardens incorporated Indigenous plants from the region that it was located, and offer sources of medicinal qualities. All the plants had medicinal qualities and a habitat for butterflies, and likely other wild pollinators who have co-evolved with these plants. MacDonald was born in 1941 in Sydney, Nova Scotia, which is within Mi'kmaq territory. He lived for many years in Vancouver, BC. His artwork is part of major collections in the National Gallery of Canada, Vancouver Art Gallery of Ontario, Kamloops Art Gallery, and has been exhibited nationally and internationally. He started making documentaries in the late 70s for anti-nuclear activist groups, and by the 80s, he dedicated his video work to Indigenous issues, making documentaries for the Native Brotherhood in British Columbia. From researching and planting MacDonald's gardens, I have come to understand them as spaces of contemplation and spaces for slowing down, to be in relation to other living beings. I've thought of them as knowledge systems, meaning they hold space for the interconnectedness between human, plant, soil, and insect mutualisms. His video garden artworks comprise a constellation that asserts the interconnection between human and more than human relations, offering a perspective that questions that questions large-scale resource extraction projects. And I consider his garden, and the reason I say that is because a lot of his work was around, his video work with communities was in some way advocating to help advocate for the land, for the people's connection to that land, and therefore evidence that resource extraction would be detrimental to that. So I just wanted to say that. I consider his gardens as kind of restorations. However, restoration seems to suggest being resolved or solved, and I find that McDonald's gardens raise more questions and tensions rather than merely solving the problem of ecologically and socially problems so evident in grass monocultures, let's say. But not just the social phenomenon of the lawn that I'm concerned with here, but also interested in counter-colonial landscapes as a parallel concept to McDonald's gardens. And there's some good writing by Jill Cassett in her book, Sowing Landscapes in Colonization Empire, around counter-colonial landscapes, and based and focused around the Caribbean. But I think that I'm drawing from that that chapter because I think there's some really interesting connections to be made there. So in this paper, I've taken up the term that Kyle White uses in his scholarship, that being collective continuance. I mentioned it earlier, as a kind of assertion of cultural knowledge building and continuing. And I see this really useful in discussing McDonald's medicine butterfly gardens and what it means to take time with them and to understand their meaning. McDonald planted his gardens across the country and would drive from coast to coast each summer to tend to them. This mapping and remapping with the planting of gardens and also tending to them asserts a re-inscription of land through restoring Indigenous flora. Yet in some cases, he introduces a contradiction or tension in the form of a plant that is not Indigenous and seemingly may seem out of place. And so within the composition of the garden, it would be predominantly, so far what I've seen is predominantly Indigenous plants, but there's often one plant that causes attention, that is an introduced plant. So adaptive and adopted, these introduced plants from Europe or outside of Canada open up the concept of invasive, suggesting a metaphor for colonization. The invasive, introduced, or misplaced insect or plant appears in different ways through McDonald's gardens. This is done by design, and also because gardens are porous and open to the dispersal of seeds in the wind and carried by animals. So seeds are key players in the ecology of migration and evidence of the movement that plays out in these growing spaces. With some of McDonald's writings, he reflects on the focus of Indigenous plants, but also the value of use of some introduced plants. There's a really interesting article that I'm going to build into this paper a bit more, that's also written by Kyle White and a large group of people, that looks at invasive species from an Indigenous perspective. And some of the arguments in the paper are, well, one of them is the self-determination for Indigenous people to determine how they want invasive species removed, and also the vulnerability discourse around invasive species. In this paper, they discuss that as a kind of that it doesn't leave open the possibilities that some introduced plants are useful, and that could be self-determined by different nations what's useful or not. So there's kind of an interesting branch there that I can pull in. Okay. In 1999, McDonald planted a butterfly garden at the Walter Phillips Gallery at the Banff Centre in Alberta. And to my knowledge, this is the only one of his gardens that still exists. So if you're out there and you know another one, please tell me. As part of the gallery's collection, the garden is cared for and maintained. In my research project, the project I mentioned earlier that is with my colleague Sheila Kola, the project called Finding Flowers, we visited this garden in August 2019 with the specific intention of learning more about McDonald through the gardens. So this garden is planted between two buildings. Plants and shrubs grow on either side of this cobblestone path. And at first glance, the garden looks untended, and somewhat feral. And although distinct from a composed ornamental garden, this garden takes up the identity of what I call the bush and signifies a remoteness where trees, plants, and shrubs are mostly left to their own inclinations. And as an artwork, McDonald's Butterfly Garden has a care plan here at the Walter Phillips Gallery. However, over the last 20 years, seeds have spread, rhizomes have nestled beyond their original planting, and branches reach far from their original saplings. So things are going, there's lots of things growing there. In 2009, the gallery invited curator, educator, and caretaker of McDonald's Butterfly Garden, Catherine Ilatalo, to join in the caretaking and stewardship of the garden. In her article, Mike MacDonald's Butterfly Garden, The Little Garden That Could, Ilatalo explains she approached the garden as a curator and horticulturalist wanting to understand the artist's intention. Her work started by mapping the garden and finding out the many types of plants that exist in the garden. So this is something from the Walter Phillips Gallery, a mapping of the garden. Her remapping of the garden unearthed 93 different plants. Most are indigenous plants, with the exception of things like dandelion, clover, buttercups, oxeye daisies, and thistles, which likely migrated into this growing space with wind, birds, or mice who carry around seeds. So you can see she also kind of divided it into categories: trees, shrubs, wildflowers, grasses, species identified, not yet labeled, and then she had this ongoing invasive species to be removed, which included oxeye daisy, buttercup, and thistle. In planting his garden, McDonald purchased some plants, but he also transplanted plants from around the national park, because the Walter Phillips Gallery is at the Banff Center for the Arts, and Banff Center for the Arts is in the Banff National Park. So as recounted by one of the preparators assisting McDonald with his garden, he said that they would drive around the park in a pickup truck, stopping at different places to find and learn about the plants of this place, transplanting some for his butterfly garden. As I mentioned before, important to his work are the tensions between plants that are indigenous to a site and including some that are introduced species. This inclusion was not merely an intervention by McDonald, but a reflection of the reality of plants that had already established themselves. This leads to a plant story shared with me one early morning by a longtime employee at the Banff Center. He reminded me that planting a garden in a national park means following guidelines and observing restrictions of what plants can be used. The park's experts oversaw and approached each plant's appropriateness to the integrity of the flora in this protected area, which is interesting when we see from Ilatalo's survey of the garden that many introduced plants are present and no one can really control invasive plants. McDonald had to go through a process of paperwork that involved getting approval for the plants he planned to include. He presented the park biologist with a plant list and it was approved except for one. And McDonald asked the official why he did not approve the stinging nettle, and the park rep said that plant is not indigenous to the park. We don't have it here. McDonald informed him that the park has the red admiral butterfly and therefore has to have stinging nettle as the butterfly lays its eggs on the plant. And what I like about this exchange is that McDonald could read this space, this park, this protected area in such detail that his understanding of medicine and butterflies seemed to be meticulous. And, you know, it was a challenge to the authority of national parks, which was really interesting. More kick-ass than interesting. The story was so important to understanding the way that McDonald worked and how there were institutional challenges and tensions within these garden artworks, whether in the case where one plant seemed to not belong, or whether it was him digging up plants within a national park and prioritizing the medicine plants and butterflies. Part of the maintenance of the Banff garden is the ongoing removal of thistle, vetch, oxeye daisy, and buttercup. In researching this site, our team also gave back to the space by tending to it and pulling out large amounts of vetch vines that are aggressive ground cover, and they also grow up a lot of the plants, and also removing many thistle plants. But you know, the thistle plants will come back, we know it. So here's some images from that. And that's Dana Prieto, who's our research associate, who's been amazing working on this project with us, as you can see, working hard as well. To mark our time as artists, both Dana and I are artists. To mark our time here, we created dye baths with some of the vetch and thistle. McDonald's artwork focused on land and environment, connected and not separate from human life. His video art makes visible First Nations community bonds with land and territory. And so here we wanted to make visible our time, our combination, and our contribution in our learning by making dye baths with so-called weeds from the garden. Oh. So through his work, I think about scale and legibility of land. I also consider that his garden as artworks were firmly rooted and informed by his process of making documentary and video making. His gardens are in part a land remediation project in that planting of indigenous plants on the exterior of museums or art galleries builds soil and creates a small gittigan of plants and insect biodiversity, but are also a kind of remediation of the museum or institution systems themselves. One example already mentioned is his exchange with Parks Canada. And I would call that a remediation in a sense that informing the park of what is in the park is kind of an interesting mediation anyway. For museums, having a garden as an artwork demands care of the land outside the gallery and deeper acknowledgement by the gallery of the land on which it stands. On a symbolic level, these butterfly and medicine gardens re-inscribe the material land tensions and pressures that collide in processes of development, whether they be parks, industries, real estate plans, or even golf courses. During the late 80s and early 1990s, McDonald worked with the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en tribal council to document oral histories from elders who were not able to go to court to testify in support of the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en challenged the provincial government and the Crown for title and jurisdiction over their land. What we know now is the Dalgamut case. Through this time working in Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en territory, he also made video installation sculptures that use the arrangement of video monitors to display complex compositions of synced videos, creating a chorus of video work. Through his work, Seven Sisters, he brings together images of the Seven Sisters mountain range in Gitxsan territory in the northern interior of what we know now is now known as British Columbia. Seven Sisters is a 7-monitor video sculpture, which each monitor is a different size, signifying the different peaks of the BC mountain range with the same name. And throughout the duration of the videos, scenes change from the idyllic scenic mountain landscapes with treetops and rock outcrops to aerial shots of similar regions with clear-cut logging. What I refer to as a kind of redaction of the landscape, where the knowledge, memories, songs, and stories of this place still exist, but the ecosystem is degraded and swaths of forest are mostly removed, eroding away the knowledge, possibly eroding away the knowledge that's attached to that which is obscured. And the videos then change to scenes from natural history museums of close-up shots presenting taxidermy, mountain wildlife, signaling colonial logics and museum collections, and also possibly also thinking about the detrimental effect clear cutting has on animals. McDonald's explains that this work calls for changing methods of resource extraction, asking, for example, that the hemlock forest be spared and that different plants and fungi be considered as a more sustainable harvest. The video installation is accompanied by healing songs sung by Gitxsan hereditary chief Mary Johnson. And as McDonald explains, it's set as a soundtrack to heal the land. In his book, Hungry Listening, solo sound scholar Dylan Robinson describes from a Gitxsan perspective, describes a Gitxsan sort of concept of how songs function to prove relationship to place and territory, emphasizing its events, relations, and past. Robinson goes on to recount that Chief Mary Johnson, same person who did this soundtrack, sang a time immemorial song in court as evidence supporting the Gitxsan and Wet'suwet'en proof of jurisdiction over their territories. And although the presiding judge would not hear it, this example of song as evidence of people's bond to their territory makes me consider that the legibility of land is part of the memory, stories, and understanding of place that the song evokes. And these are integral to the rights and privileges of territory, these songs. McDonald's video work shows the value of song and brings song and land together into the artwork. Land and territory, especially in the face of industry and state interests that often reduce land to commodity or property. His artwork, Electronic Totem, serves further as a poetics of evidence in presenting the Gitxsan bond and understanding of their territory, as each monitor shows different bonds to land, so bonds and knowledge. So fishing, berry picking, and other positive things, with also Chief Mary Johnson also singing. And the judge ruled against Gitxsan Wet'suwet'en evaluating the evidence of their presence on the land through Eurocentric lens, using agricultural land use as a measure. And the trajectory of McDonald's work, I would say, connects to Indigenous territory and land contestations. And mostly I say this because he's taking up different spaces on the land, but also his work with Wet'suwet'en and Gitxsan. Okay. One of the original stories of McDonald's turn to planting gardens as artworks comes from sites of contested land and land slated for clear cutting. From an interview with art critic John Grand, McDonald recounts his experiences working with elders on a medicine plant garden in the Gitxsan community. During his project, he was taking photos of plants in the valley near Kitawanga, BC, and butterflies would often land on plants and flowers he was photographing or shooting with his video camera. He showed these images to elders, and the elder explained that the butterfly would show him the medicine plants that he needed to heal and be healthy. From then on, McDonald considered butterflies as teachers and would study the plants that he observed them landing on. And this is in part the beginning of his work with medicine plants and butterflies. He continued to learn more about medicinal plants and to research the mutualisms between these plants and butterflies. He continued to learn by hosting butterflies in his backyard in Vancouver. He lived in Vancouver for many years. His garden had over 60 Indigenous plant varieties. However, even this urban habitat was vulnerable to the aerial spraying of BTK that combat gypsy moth caterpillar infestations. And one of his most ambitious artworks, Secret Flowers, juxtaposed imagery of butterflies and flowers with aerial spraying in the sky above Vancouver. And this violence of toxicity spurred on McDonald's garden work. So that's another kind of origin story of his work. And here's an article about his work. Our first planting of one of the gardens began with a visit with the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery senior curator Crystal Mowry to the Woodland Cultural Centre in Brantford, Ontario. In part, Mowry was reaching out on behalf of a regional public gallery to Six Nations Cultural Centre because of the location of the museum, both museums on the Haldimand track. Six Nations history includes the contentious and unfulfilled Haldimand Proclamation, which intended that the land 6 miles on either side of the river from Elora, Ontario to Lake Erie would compensate the Haudenosaunee after fighting alongside the British in the American Revolution. And knowing they had not fulfilled an agreement to ensure the Six Nations original lands and traditional lands, the British promised them the Grand River tract of land. But the land transfer did not happen in the way it was, and reparations resulted in much smaller land base of Six Nations today. And moving the community was a long drawn out process of British capitalist expansion, and the imposition of private property and land ownership meant that the state could then allocate land and its use in Ontario. So I think it's significant that both galleries were on this tract of land and that both were replanting these gardens. We approached the Woodland Cultural Centre knowing that McDonald had created a garden there, but that it was no longer there. And the curator at the time, Naomi Johnson, happened to be working as an intern earlier in her career when Mike actually put the garden in 2006, I think. And so she created this diagram in the catalog, which gave us a recipe for the garden, which was awesome. So we collaborated with the Woodland Cultural Centre and the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery, and we created an exhibition called, I created an exhibition called Planting One Another in 2018. featuring a twin planting of the medicine and butterfly gardens by Mike MacDonald at the Woodland Cultural Center and at the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery. And we planted this particular design. Comprised of plants we might see in pollinator gardens, like coneflowers. I noted that his garden wheel is seasonal with many other layers of meaning and includes early season plants like strawberries and late fall blooming plants like goldenrod, representing a consideration of food for butterflies and other wild pollinators through the growing season. And these are the material considerations, but also this in an artwork that functions in the symbolic ways too. And as mentioned earlier, McDonald's gardens often have intentional tension where a particular plant might be introduced or not indigenous to a region. With this garden plan, he planted hops at the base of each teepee pole. Hops have origins in Europe. They grow like vines and have small cone like flowers called stromboli, which are commonly harvested for flavoring beer, for making tea and other edible uses. And they have rhizome root systems, meaning these roots are like stems and they're prolific and tenacious. Multiple stems grow from the crown of the rhizome and twine around each other. They're covered in stiff hairs. They grab onto surfaces and therefore can climb on each of the poles, expanding and creating shade over the garden in mid-late summer. So how might we consider the symbolism of the tenacious climbing hop plant? These materials and symbolic tensions are similar to my mention of the stinging nettle in the garden, the Banff garden discussed earlier in this plan. And I think part of this discussion, which I'm going to expand in the final paper around invasive species, I think I want to complicate the idea of like indigenous and not or like indigenous plants and invasive. I want to complicate the kind of gray areas, somewhat like the article I mentioned earlier about that talked about self-determination in invasive species, and also looking at invasive species from an indigenous perspective. We source plants for the twin planting from Gayanase, a greenhouse grower of Six Nations, but and also artist Ron Banner brought a whole bunch of plants to contribute. He knew Mike and he had worked with Mike in previous years, so he was feeling quite dedicated to this project too. But I further sourced plants from my own home in Port Severn, and my colleague Dana Prieto and I took a day to dig up some transplants. To me, this made sense to bring plants from my traditional territory, from my home, as a way of giving to the gardens from the land that sustains me, and also the land that I understand and is legible to me. So this was an important part of the project as I challenged myself to find as many of the plants that I could from the land that I've lived on for almost 20 years. And being late June, some of the plants like goldenrod and Joe pieweed had no blooms, but I remembered where they were and what they looked like without their flowers. And I sent Dana to an area I knew had wild strawberries, and I took on the challenge to dig up a couple of milkweed plants that were growing among poison ivy. So this story has the success of identifying plants and confirming that I really know, I know the plants that live around my house. But also this is part of the story is where my overconfidence of thinking I can dig up a plant without making contact with the ruling poison ivy was proved me wrong, basically. The twin planting of this one garden was symbolic of creating connections between museums. I could argue that, yes, between the Kitchener-Waterloo Art Gallery and the Woodland Cultural Center, and also building more of an understanding of the land that they're on. But due to COVID, we haven't had gatherings and collaborations around the garden spaces. And that was part of the plan with Finding Flowers, was that we would research these gardens and then maybe we would replant them, but we would get to know and build relationships in those different spaces to see whether a garden needed to be replanted. And through this project, so it's a bit stalled out, but the research continues. So as we plan with former and future sites for this garden, I'm conscious of how these sites from Halifax to Edmonton and hopefully Vancouver are not about our project coming in and making a garden, but about building those relationships and understanding that the planting starts in the conversation with the local communities and organizations. Their knowledge of plants and language inform each garden. And Secwepemc artist Tanya Willard of Bush Gallery is hosting a McDonald garden, and it will be the first, to my knowledge, to be on a reserve, as Bush Gallery is based at Secwepemc territory in interior BC. Let's just go here. So this is us planting these gardens. You can see the teepee poles. This is a further in the season with the you can see the hop plants are growing up the teepee poles there, and you can see some of them made it to the top. So I'm in Hamilton now. We're in Hamilton, and the great thing about that is, for me, was that there was one garden that was one of his gardens, or at least it was identified in his artist, the materials I've been researching and reading through, that there was a garden at Gage Park. And so when I was invited to do artwork or to be in the show at McMaster and to do these lectures, I wanted to look at that garden. So I'll just tell you a little bit about it. In the year 2000, which is quite a long time ago, Hamilton Artist Inc., which is Hamilton's oldest artist-run center, produced the project called Zone 6B, and it was organized and curated by Shirley Maddel and Ivan Jurakic. The Inc. published a catalog in 2003 that includes an image and artist statement of Mike MacDonald's commissioned artwork, which was called Butterfly Reservation. And Ivan shared with me where Mike planted. Ivan and I went for a walk in Gage Park about a month ago, and he showed me where Mike MacDonald planted. And it was here in the perennial border gardens, which are, I guess, right along Main Street. Anyway, near the Children's Museum, there are these large concrete planters, and those are called the perennial border gardens. And what Mike's project was that these were composed Victorian gardens, and that he did an intervention of planting Indigenous plants in these gardens, in these Victorian composed gardens. So it involved introducing blanket flower, different pollinator flowers into this already composed garden. So it's an intervention. It wasn't just a Mike MacDonald garden. It was that he was intervening into the existing composed gardens. And Gage Park is a site which I've noted. I've walked around it quite a lot now. I know it a bit more. But it is a site that brings together, all these different plants and trees from different places. And some of the trees have actual like metal labels nailed into them. So there's a kind of display. There's a kind of like bringing all of these plants from different parts of the world into one place. There's a kind of like international expo of plants that's happening at Gage Park, which I think is an interesting kind of colonial project in terms of landscaping as well. And also the greenhouse is phenomenal. There's like amazing plants that I would never see in my lifetime had I not gone to to the greenhouse at Gage Park. So I created an audio walk to rather than replanting what Mike did. I realized that we didn't really remember these gardens very well, or this project very well. The archive does not hold much about this garden intervention of Mike's. So this is Mike here with his butterfly on his back. And so what I was interested in doing is making an audio walk that helped us. Well, I wanted to think about how can we remember something together? How can we remember something together that doesn't have a lot of memories to start off with? So I thought, well, what I can do is make this audio walk, and I called it Finding What Grows. And I created and chose a route through Gage Park, but I also but it's also a story. The audio walk is like a story of what I've learned about Mike MacDonald. And it's a way to share what I've learned as you walk through that garden. As you walk through that park. So that is a current project. You can go on the audio walk on your own, and all you need to do is scan the QR code that is available from the McMaster Museum of Art. And the project's called Finding What Grows. And you can just walk through the park with that playing on if you have a smartphone, hopefully, and you can stream it, you can listen to it. Otherwise, you can also just listen to it and walk around wherever, I think. But that is the project that that through this distinguished professor residency and through working with the McMaster Art Museum, I was able to advance this research in a way, and do this research as a curator, but also as an artist, creating a piece of an audio piece in response to the garden. I would say is part of the research that I've done with this, and so I'm really happy to have been able to do that here. So again, considering these gardens within the paradigm of returning land and land back, especially ending this paper at the Heldeman track where land back lane continues to hold strong, the act of planting native plants on municipal lands is a mnemonic, a reminder, a remembering, a call to use plant, land, language knowledge, which is one part of the intangible value of land with our languages that asserts Indigenous presence. As we continue this project, each site comes from the local communities. So what we do at each site will come from the local communities, whether they are urban, Indigenous, or on reserve. As mentioned earlier, McDonald's medicine and butterfly garden artworks are more than a response or a reaction to colonial landscapes. They are sites to assert energy towards continuance of land and plant knowledge and language. They represent a way of looking at the world that does not separate humans and nature. If we think of land and waterways as readable, a kind of document without the edges of a page limiting its breadth, rather with a range that is fluid and ever-changing, living and legible, then we can see how one's understanding of land grows over long periods of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisa. It's just so thrilling to listen to this talk, especially after having experienced the audio walk. Elise from the McMaster Museum has popped the SoundCloud file for Finding What Grows into the chat if anyone wants to open that up and be able to, go for an audio walk in the comfort of their own home. So yeah. Yeah,
you can go out for an audio walk, but you can lay down and relax.
Yeah. Or spend time maybe in your own garden if you have one. But yeah. So I'd like to invite people for a Q&A, and I welcome people to turn their cameras on. It makes us and Lisa feel as if we're in a room with people. And also, you're welcome to use the chat function. So I'm going to moderate this next stage. Sally, are you just waving, or do you want to start with something?
Sally's the question asker today.
I was just saying hello. That was wonderful, Lisa. Thank you so much. That was just really a really great talk. I don't have a question at the moment, but I really appreciate you sharing with us. It was fantastic.
Thanks, Sally. Appreciate that.
Catherine, please.
Hi, Lisa. Thanks. That was very neat. My question is not especially well formed, but that's okay.
That's okay. I'll still accept it.
Thanks. With my grad students today, we were talking a little bit about rhizomes and the differences between rhizomes and taproots. So when you started talking about rootedness, I was reminded of that. And so, so this is not a well-formed question, but I wondered if you would revisit that idea of rootedness that you brought up early on. I think you said that rootedness was part of what it is to be resilient. But then you talked about the hops having the rhizomes and whether or not they're invasive. And as I said, not a great question, but it seems like there are some ideas there that I would like to explore.
Yeah,
more.
no, yeah, totally. I appreciate you mentioning, thank you for that, because I think that there's a kind of, I think that's a really, really strong, I think it's a strong point that maybe I could build a little bit more too, but yeah, I'm sorry, I'm trying to build a ill-formed answer to your ill-formed question, so it's really fun. No, but I get your point. I think I mean, of course, there's like a whole Deleuzian kind of theory around rhizomes. So, but if we keep it in the plant terms and thinking about, I really valued coming across. It was a very small little piece that Wanda Nanabush had written, and it brought up this idea of roots, and I think it was let me see, as roots being part of resistance. And I think I said around resilience, right? So and rootedness being part of resilience, or being part of resilience. And I think maybe in terms of what my interpretation of Wanda Nanabush's what she was saying about, here, I'm just looking for it here. She talked about this one, like a translation of translated the word resistance translated into one Anishinaabe dialect. So it's not every, there's this particular dialect that she found that infers rootedness. And that it becomes a metaphor for planting or plant being planted. And so for me, in terms of that, I was thinking about, I kind of relate that to this idea of traditional territory, or thinking about, and even just thinking about all the court cases of First Nations, fighting for Aboriginal land title, and, we're persevering through a legal system that was designed to exclude, them or us. So I feel like there's something interesting about that question about rootedness, that it doesn't just mean like, oh, we have roots here, therefore we own this, but to me it has to do with a kind of, it goes back to what I was saying about the songs, the knowledge, the understanding of say a certain land space, like if it's my traditional territory or something, and then I know that so and so used to fish here and this and that, and also the significance of songs really being important to the rights and responsibilities to land. Like I think those are some of the intangible things that connect people and are make people planted or rooted. So yeah, I think that those are the things that your question made me think of. I don't know if that helps.
If I could throw a little more in there, it makes me think of Jordan Abel, the most recent book, Nishka, where he talks about.
Oh, what's that one?
Nishka, Jordan Abel.
Oh yeah, okay, yeah. He just launched that book, right?
Yeah. It just came out.
It's like a memoir, right?
It's a lot of it is transcripts of talks.
Oh, okay. Okay.
It's pretty neat. It's a pretty quick read. And a lot of what he's expressing, I don't think he uses the term rootedness, but you kind of get the sense of rootlessness, of having been severed from the community and the territory. And so what you were talking about there with the resistance and the resilience being connected to plantedness and rootedness reminded me of Abel's description of dispossession. And
yeah, that's what I was just gonna say.
I think there's a sense of rootlessness there.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting point, but I think that rootlessness is a bit too absolute. Like I think that they're like
Yeah.
I'm thinking about, yes, dispossession, you know, we can't just go, oh, everybody's rooted in their territory, so therefore everything's great. You know, everybody's, you know, we have our roots, because yeah, there's a huge, you know, of course, there's a huge history of dispossession from lands, and so coming back to this, so I think that when you were mentioning rootlessness, I think there's still some kind of roots there, even
Yeah.
like, but it's a long project to sort of unpack that and put that into other terms. But yeah, so you were just saying like he was writing about dispossession or his own
And about having to learn the stories and the knowledges of his nation from the colonizer, basically.
yeah.
Which
is an interesting, I think that's a really interesting point, actually. That's great. Okay, I'm just gonna write this.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, no, thank you for that.
And then I will mute and let someone else ask a
And I think that actually pushes, that makes me think, and this is a bit of a departure from what I've written about, but it makes me think about the institutionalization or the institutional taking up of, you know, traditional knowledge or something like that, and like how some of the, you know, when it is sort of taken up and processed and then delivered through institution, that it's institutionalized. It has a different function. It has a different kind of life, let's say, than say things that are existing and circulating within community. It has a different life. It has a different economy as well. So anyway, anybody else?
I'll mute. Thanks.
Thank you.
Well, that just made me think about the fact that the very first Mike MacDonald garden is going to be at Bush Gallery. Like that's not
the first one on a reserve.
Yeah, and like not affiliated with a colonial kind of art museum institution. And it'll be really interesting to see what emerges, what roots itself from that. But I was also thinking about how this active remembering that you're going through, rather than a replanting, but that this remembering is also like a rerooting. Like you're putting down different kinds of roots through these memories, these stories, this archival curatorial praxis, and it's just a different kind of root, I think, but still very significant.
Oh, remembering instead of replanting. That's interesting.
Yeah. Is there anyone else that would like to share anything or ask a question? And again, you're welcome to use the chat.
Okay, I do have a question. If
Come on, Sally, bring it
on. So I'm really interested in this idea of invasive and challenging the you know, as a good like settler trying to be an ally, thinking about plants, we're like, we've got to get rid of all the invasive species and rip them out or spray them with Roundup or whatever we have to do to get the Phragmites out of the wetlands so that we can restore it to something that's more indigenous in terms of plants. And this summer I heard a panel it was really good. The RBG put on a panel with traditional ecological knowledge keepers, and Nick Rio was talking about a sort of different perspective on invasive species from an indigenous perspective. And what really struck me about it was that he was maybe not so much thinking that like, yeah, the Phragmites is good and we want to keep it, but that the approach is just still so colonial, right? The approach to the invasive as a thing that needs to be eradicated to create some ideal form. And that's been sticking with me, and I've been puzzling over it. And so I'm really interested in this, your challenging of, or sort of wanting to like unpack or expand on Indigenous notions of invasiveness in plants, and just like, what are your, if you had more to say about that, it'd be really great to hear.
Yeah, okay. It's sort of the part of the paper that I'm sort of just trying to work through, but this is helpful. This is really helpful. So a couple things that come to mind. One thing is like these terms are really important, and I'm not an environmental policy person, but I do work with some. So so then there's just a little bit of, you get enough knowledge that you can say something, but you don't really know what you're talking about. But anyway, so these terms are really important. This is something I learned from Sheila. And in terms of policy, if something is deemed a weed, and in the city of Toronto, if it's deemed a weed, then there's a policy that would apparently anyway, a policy, and people will respond. Somebody grows their front lawn into weeds. I think they changed the bylaws now, but anyway. So I was thinking about how terminology is so important in relation to policy and the sort of rules that are written around these things. So this designation of invasive is important, because something can be an exotic plant. So these are the terms that I find are used in talking about plants. There's the exotic invasive. So the exotic can be not from here and can be kind of, but can live in I guess, live in a way that doesn't push out the other plants. But invasive is invasive, and invasive is causing problems and is taking over. So I guess I'm not so much like I'm interested in how people are writing about, or how from an Indigenous perspective, invasive is in terms of plants and different species is being written about. And yeah, so the gist, or the sort of impression that I get from this article, which I think is it's 2017, and it was one of the first articles written on invasive species from Indigenous perspective, and it's called Invasive Species, Indigenous Stewards and Vulnerability Discourse. And I'd really love to, Sally, to talk to you about who was talking about that, like from that panel you were at. So here's one quote that I thought about putting in the paper so far, but I haven't yet. Well, maybe not a quote, but a section that is interesting. So I'll just read it. Whatever Indigenous peoples are doing today to approach invasive species flows out of their own histories with environmental change, and how these histories shape their assumptions today about the meaning or significance of their current interactions with novel species. Ooh, that's another term, novel species. These histories and assumptions, which do not flow out of non-Indigenous frameworks such as the Anthropocene, shape what Indigenous peoples view as appropriate approaches to invasive species, without losing sight of the reality of Indigenous vulnerabilities and Indigenous suffering. Our focus is on so in this paper, they're focusing on what Indigenous peoples' agency will hopefully disclose about Indigenous strategies, knowledge, and capabilities for stewardship and policy responses to invasive species. So and there's a lot of discussion about Western, like so-called like Western scientific approaches to invasive, and some just, and the paper's very, it goes through the whole data collection, the methodology and everything like that. So it talks about, and it gives some discussion around the feedback from their participants. Because they went around to different communities and talked to different elders and things about invasive species. So yeah, there's very practical things in this article too, about even down to like basic hand pulling of plants is more effective than a lot of other approaches. So anyway, as you can see, I'm still working through it, but I think I was really interested in this idea of self-determination. In like what some feedback that they received from some of the participants was that that these communities' approach to invasive species, they perceive them as opportunities to exercise self-determination. So in different ways. So like building relationship with non-Indigenous parties who were also part of this project. They also they could also, this was an interesting place, and this is a gray area too, right? So they were also finding ways to build self-determining capacities to harness Western science. So how will we employ what Western science has to offer? So it's not just like, we can't do that because, you know, it's not Indigenous, but it's just like, how do we incorporate that in a useful way, in a way that is, it will, you know, align with Indigenous knowledge and approaches. So, and also connecting to science, Indigenous sciences, right? So like it's a kind of like interesting exchange and use, I think. And so they also propose that the last thing is like that, that in interactions with that Indigenous responses to and interactions with invasive species provide opportunity to renew and expand Indigenous knowledges, including determining the nature of novel relationships between Indigenous peoples and invasive species. So anyway, the article's like, I'm just kind of like, hey, why don't I just read the whole thing to you? But like when I first got, and this was, okay, so a respondent that responded to this paper suggested this other paper, and it was so refreshing. It was so I was so happy that and then when I read this paper, I was just like kind of yelling out loud, like, I love this paper, just because the ideas are things that I'm starting to think about, but I hadn't. And that's almost the most exciting thing, when you come across an article that's writing something that you didn't know how to say, or I mean, of course I wouldn't do a study like that. I'm not from that discipline, but you find the ideas that you were starting to think about. It's really cool. I like that. Anyway, how's that, Sally? Thanks for your question.
Thanks, Sally. Thanks, Lisa. Any final questions or thoughts? Otherwise, I know Lisa actually also visited with our 3rd and 4th year studio art students today. So, and still has another talk coming up with our gender and social justice grad students. She's been doing, in addition to the walks, a number of visits in classes on campus virtually. So a huge thank you for today. It was a big day for you, and yes, for all the work you've done as our distinguished professor. And I just want to say that it is very well deserved, and we have been so privileged to have you join us at McMaster this fall. And for those of you that haven't had an opportunity to go on the walk, I really encourage you, whether it's in your jammies, in your lounge chair, or actually in Gage Park. Yeah, and I think it would be really lovely when the QR code gets installed in the park, because I'd be interested to do it in different seasons. Having done it in the early part of the fall, like in late September, I'd like to return with some students again in the spring. So really thinking about the time of year and walking and remembering Mike. So thank you, Lisa. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you for having me and inviting me, and it's been a real honor. And yeah, it's like I said, it's sort of not it. It's just, yeah, kind of very thrilling. Not kind of, it's really. I'm gonna put a link in for the museum the art gallery, so that you all know the show that I'm talking about. Anyway, but yeah, thank you so much. Miigwech. Awesome.
And thank you to everyone who's here with us in the Zoom. I also realize it's a long day for many faculty and students and teachers who've joined us, and to everyone in the YouTube channel, thank you for also showing up in a different format. And so, yes, I will say good night, and thank you to everyone who has been here.
Thank you.